All right, Ross Douthat, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So you got a new book out, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. So let's start off with this definitions. What do you mean by decadence? Because I think most people associate that with chocolate or sex.
Right. And, there's some chocolate and sex in the book. But mostly I'm arguing that we should understand decadence to mean stagnation, drift, repetition, and boredom at a really high level of wealth and civilizational development. So basically, once a society hits a certain point of, for want of a better word, success, and its growth rates slow down, it stops thinking about the future, its political arguments go in circles, its culture starts to repeat itself. And I think boredom is kind of the key thing. So if you think about sex, the decadence of the real decadence with sex is like the most boring orgy in the world, basically.
So before we get to your case that our current culture is a decadent one, let's take a look at history. Are there any other examples from previous societies or civilizations where you saw that they arrived at decadence the way you define it?
Yeah, I think decadence is a pretty normal historical phenomenon, and just about every society that has any kind of success goes through decadent phases or enters decadent periods, right? So the obvious example is if you start the clock on the Roman Empire around the time that, the famous orgies are happening, right, in Nero's Rome, and then you run forward to the actual fall of Rome or the fall of the Western Roman Empire, that's about 400 years. And there are, moments of vigor and creativity in that span, but basically you could say that the Roman Empire was in various ways decadent for centuries before it fell apart. Or to pick examples from the second millennium, the Ottoman Empire for about 150 years, in the time when it got called the sick man of Europe, was pretty obviously decadent. The Chinese Empire in the 100 years before, as European powers gradually picked away at it. So those are sort of big famous examples, but really any rich society is going to have decadent phases and periods when it sort of gets stuck and can't figure out how to advance. So it's a very normal thing for successful societies to enter into.
And why is that? Is it because once you reach a level of success, you're just starting to play, you're playing not to lose, you're just trying to keep what you got, so you're not taking in risk to make advances?
Yeah, it's some of that. Some of it is that, there are sort of limits to human creativity in a particular cultural context. And so it makes sense that after you've, to take the case of the United States, after you've invented the great American novel and invented the movie industry and then revolutionized the movie industry a few more times, you might start to run out of ideas and just start making the same Star Wars movies over and over again, right? And in the same way in politics, right? So if you build up a really successful constitutional order or a really successful system of government, over time, the system sort of gets big and heavy and locked in, and it's too big to fail. In the language of the last financial crisis, it gets harder and harder to reform it. So even if you want to change and adapt the system to new realities, it gets harder and harder to do that. And I think, that's what you see in Washington, D.C. right now. But I think your original point is right, too, that, once a society is really successful, it runs out of enemies to challenge it. It runs out of, fears to motivate it, and it gets older. Right, and this is a big thing that's happened in the Western world. We have fewer kids, society's gotten older, and being rich and old is a good recipe for decadence.
So I've seen you start to flesh out these ideas in your articles in the New York Times for about a year or so. But when did you start noticing that America and Western society has probably entered into a decadent phase?
So in a certain way, I've been working on this book for like 6 or 7 years, I guess. And I got sort of sidetracked by other projects and personal stuff. But so I really started working on it after the 2012 election, which is a long time ago now. And part of the motivation was that we had just lived through this massive financial crisis where in the aftermath, everyone in my profession was saying, well, this changes everything. It's going to radically transform our politics in all these kind of ways. And instead, we ended up in 2012 with, Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney in what was in certain ways the most boring and dispiriting imaginable presidential election. And this, I had come of age as a journalist and writer after 9/11. So I had gone through this cycle once before where, some big event happens and people say, well, this is the moment when our decadence ends and vigor is restored and new things happen. And then politics fell quickly back into the same patterns as before. So having gone through that twice, I felt like there was sort of a lesson there, which is that even big events, even financial crises and massive terrorist attacks don't necessarily change the trajectory of a wealthy, stable, somewhat stagnant society that much. Now, obviously, when I, was planning to publish the book, I wasn't anticipating that we would get yet another immense world-altering disaster happening while I was actually out promoting the book. So it remains to be seen whether the pandemic will have effects that 9/11 and the financial crisis didn't have. It's certainly possible that it could be a bigger jolt and an actual redirection. But so far, I think Western civilization has come through the 30 years since the Cold War ended without having its stagnation altered that much, even by dramatic seeming events.
Well, let's dig into the different types of stagnation that you highlight in your book. And the first one is economic stagnation. And I've seen this argument put out by Tyler Cowen, the economist. It may look like we're making a lot of progress economically, technological innovation, but really not. I mean, so what is the evidence that economists point to that say really the world has been economically stagnant for maybe 40, 50 years?
So first, there's just a sort of deceleration in growth, right? So if you go back to the late 1960s, early 70s, which is when I sort of start my story, you have a period in the post-war era of really rapid, dramatic economic growth. And then you have the stagflation of the 1970s, and you have sort of temporary recoveries of growth under Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. But each time when the next recession comes along, it wipes out a lot of those gains. So basically, over the last couple of generations, we've settled into a normal where 4 or 5% growth is incredibly rare, and 1.5 to 2% growth is the best that we're going to get, seemingly. And over the same period, you've also had fiscal policy change dramatically. So, Western governments, and especially the United States, now run immense peacetime deficits in a way that we didn't have to 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. So basically, you have an economy where we are spending more public money in order to sort of goose extremely low growth rates, as opposed to an earlier era when when the government didn't have to do that kind of deficit spending work and you got 4 or 5% growth without it. So it's important to stress this is not the end of growth. It doesn't mean that progress has ceased entirely. People still get richer. Societies are still getting richer, but they're just doing so at a very slow pace and at a pace where we are doing this sort of weird thing where we take our own surplus and pay ourselves extra money to feel like we're growing more than we actually are.
But some people, this has kind of come up in the past 10 years. Some people are noticing like they're not experiencing that growth economically. There are people talking about like my dad did better than me financially, working a factory job, not going to college, and then here I am laden with thousands of dollars of student debt, working not a great job.
Right. Now this is something that economists, as they do, are constantly arguing about, right? Like how much better off is, the average American worker today versus 40 or 50 years ago. And there are sort of two competing theories. One theory says, look, growth has slowed down, but there has been growth. Goods and services have gotten a lot cheaper. Your TVs and iPhones are, amazing in a way that your dad working the factory job couldn't have imagined. The counter argument is that a few really big ticket things have not necessarily gotten cheaper. It's not clear that real estate has gotten cheaper. A college education has become more and more important, and that hasn't gotten cheaper. And healthcare hasn't gotten cheaper. You've had a lot of healthcare cost inflation. So there's sort of it basically depends on how you weight different things. If you say the most important thing is, sort of the cost of consumer goods and what's available to you there, then people are definitely better off. But if you say the most important thing is, a man's ability to support his family on a single income and live in a middle-class house, then things are a lot more ambiguous and it's less clear that people are better off.
And to that latter point, I just saw a meme going around. It's a picture of like a Al Bundy's house. He had this nice 2-story house, and we're like, a guy in 1987 who worked as a shoe salesman was able to live in a nice house like this. Again, it was television, but I think it's trying to make that point.
My grandparents lived in Santa Monica, California. So my dad grew up there in the 50s, and they had a 1-story sort of mission style California house, probably 3 bedrooms, nice backyard with an orange tree. And, my grandfather was God rest him, a not very successful salesman, right? He wasn't Al Bundy, but he wasn't not Al Bundy, right? And my grandmother didn't work, and they were able to afford that house in basically an earthly paradise, right? And flash forward 70 years, their house has been torn down after they passed away. The houses there are now 2 stories. They're too big for their lots. They all cost $2 million. And that's a change, right? And, and you can still get, like, the salesman might still be able to get a version of that house, maybe more cheaply made, out in an exurb somewhere in a hotter part of California that fewer people want to live in. But still, the shift from my grandfather's era to today, in that sense, is real. Now, it is also true that there are fewer men who are shoe salesmen today and more men who are white collar workers, right? So there is a smaller population of would-be Al Bundys, but there's definitely been a shift. I mean, it's the Simpsons phenomenon too, right? Like, the Simpsons home is sort of this paradigm of middle class life, and Homer Simpson is nobody's idea of an A student or uber meritocrat. And it's that Springfield, maybe it still existed in the 80s, it doesn't exist today.
Well, this point of stagnation, you make the point that technology has stagnated, which is interesting because most people think, well, no, in the past 20 years, things have sped up. We got the internet, we got smartphones, we've got Slack, TikTok, whatever. So what's the case that we're actually not innovating as much as we once did?
Well, it's similar to the argument about growth, right? That there is clear innovation in a few really significant areas, right? Digital technology and communications technology have changed immensely over the last 30 or 40 years. Silicon Valley barely existed a couple generations ago. Now it's the center of the global economy. Every time you take out your iPhone, you're experiencing an amazing technological revolution. But that revolution is most important for communication, entertainment, leisure. It's an economy of convenience. And you haven't had the same kind of changes in other areas of the economy relative to what people expected. If you go back to 1950s science fiction, people are imagining that what did happen with the computer, right? That huge computers get shrunk down and stuck in your pocket would happen with like atomic energy. So everyone would drive around a clean, safe, atomic powered automobile in the year 2020 and things like that. And that hasn't happened. We have hybrids. We're finally getting electric cars, but it's taken a very long time. Energy costs haven't been revolutionized the way people expected. Transportation hasn't been revolutionized. Things like the self-driving car get pushed further and further out. And, the same goes with health and life expectancy, right? You've made some sort of slow grinding progress against cancer in the last 30 years. But the expectations of the era when, penicillin was being invented was that you were just going to have sort of a cascade of cures that, first we cured polio and then we'll cure cancer and then we'll cure Alzheimer's and dementia. And that hasn't happened either. So the growth we've had has just been very monodimensional, very, very tech heavy. And it's been hard for tech to transform other sectors. Like when tech money leaves tech and tries to transform, how we give blood, how we take blood in pharmacies, right? You get Theranos, you get these companies that spend a ton of money and end up being frauds, or you get WeWork, we're revolutionizing workspace, and then it turns out the company isn't worth nearly what anyone expected. So there's just been a challenge of taking the one area where we've had major progress and transforming the rest of society.
And also you make the point too, and I've seen this case made as well, is that the innovations we've had in the past 40 years, like they're game changers, but they're not. Like I'd rather have indoor plumbing and electricity and I could do without my smartphone. Like I could get by and life would be, or I'd rather have antibiotics than a smartphone. So like the innovations we made, they're like,
You definitely
they're
would.
not big. I mean, they're not, it's like, it doesn't move the needle too much when in the grand scheme of things.
Right. I mean, there's a sense in which, and this is, Cowan's point, Tyler Cowan, who you mentioned earlier, that there was a range of inventions that in hindsight look like kind of low-hanging fruit, where once you figured out a few things about electricity or biology, there were a bunch of really big transformative things that you could do really quickly, basically in a 100 to 150 year period. And now we're in a period where, there's still a lot of impressive cutting edge research going on. And at some point it may cash out in revolutions. But for now, the research is more impressive than the results, I guess, is one way to look at it.
Right. You had this quote from a guy named Mark Stein talking about imagining a man in the late 19th century and going to the 1950s and coming to our age. This reminded, have you been to the Carousel of Progress at Disney World?
Yes, a long time ago, but yeah.
Yeah, that reminded me of that because, okay, so for those who don't know, the Carousel of Progress is this little ride you get in with animatronics, and there's like this dad who starts out in the 1900s, and he takes you through the advancements in technology. And you start out in the 1900s, you get the 1920s, and there's like electricity and indoor plumbing. Then you get the 1940s, more advances, and then you get the 21st century, which was made in 1993. So all the characters are like wearing neon windsuits and it's still like that. And I remember you get to the 21st century and you're just completely underwhelmed. It's like you can talk to the oven, which I guess we have with like Alexa infused ovens, but that's about it. And I was like, that's not, I'm not looking forward to the 21st century if that's what it is.
I'm looking online. Right. So they have a kid wearing a sort of Oculus Rift style headset.
Right. Yeah. Grandma has too.
In the 20, but the clothes too are, this is one of the smaller points I make in the book, and I'm stealing it from a journalist named Kurt Anderson. But, he makes the point that if you watch movies or just look at pictures from any decade in the 21st century, in the 20th century, you get this really clear distinction decade to decade in fashions and styles and what people are wearing. Nobody mistakes the 1930s for the Mad Men era. No one mistakes the Mad Men era definitely for the 1970s. And then somewhere around the 1990s, things stop changing that much. And so if you turn on Friends and Frasier now, the hairstyles are a little different. Some of the clothes are a little baggier. But there hasn't been that kind of fashion turnover either. So, the sort of Jetsons futuristic wardrobes, the jumpsuits of Star Trek and so on, none of that has actually happened, which might be a good thing. I don't want to wear the Star Trek jumpsuit, but it does suggest too that there's been this, that changes in fashion reflect changes in technology, and we haven't had either of those changes.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. Like I look at high school kids and they're wearing the same thing that I wore in high school.
Totally.
20 years ago, t-shirt, jeans, pair of Converse. That's it. Like that was my uniform, and I see kids still wearing that.
Yeah, and if you walk around a college campus, all the guys have if they're pretentious, they have the same, black pea coat that I owned when I was, young and pretending to be an adult. And it's not, it's not ugly, but it's nothing like the change from the 50s to the 70s, say.
And then, yeah, this is this idea of, repetition in culture as well. I mean, something you see too with style, and then also other parts of culture, is that we keep going back into the past for our inspiration. So like with style, you see these decades where you say, we're 90s are back now. I guess, so I think windsuits in some cases are back. That whole Seinfeld normcore thing kind of had a thing. But like there's...
The Rachel haircut came back.
The Rachel haircut came back. I'm sure like Luke Perry's sideburns are going to come back eventually. But you also see this like with films and art and music. Nothing, I mean, if you listen to a song today that was made, today compared to 20 years ago, not that much of a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last big musical innovation was the rise of rap and hip hop, which still gets cast by some people as like this, it's the new thing that the youth are into. Right? But rap and hip hop have been around. I mean, what are we now? 2020. So for 35, 40 years. And there is, I think you can make the argument that basically we're all still living inside baby boomer pop culture, and that almost everything that matters in our pop culture was sort of invented somewhere between 1930 and 1970 or 1975, with the exception of the Harry Potter stories. Right, that's the one sort of millennial era sort of pop culture juggernaut. But Star Wars, Star Trek, the entire comic book universe. If you go into a mall at Christmas time, except for Mariah Carey, 80% of the Christmas carols will be from that, period from World War II through the 1970s. And, part of that just reflects the fact that that was a really dynamic and creative era in American history. And it's not entirely a bad thing to have that kind of stuff to rework and play with. And I enjoy the Marvel movies in their way, but it is, I think, a sign of a certain kind of stuckness and repetition that did not characterize America in 1965 or so.
Yeah, with movies, you talk about reboot, like Star Wars is still going on, even though it was, the first one came out in the late 70s. The Marvel movies, that's pretty much it. And then even when they come out with the new movie, it's typically a reboot of a franchise that existed for 30 years.
Yeah, and this has happened especially in the last 20 years. So if you go back and look at the budget, the box office top 10 from, the mid 1990s, you would have one or two sequels, but it was very normal to have original movie stories that nobody had ever seen before, right? That were, no stories completely original. Everybody's reworking and remaking things. Shakespeare didn't come up with all his own stories, but there's a difference between, Mel Gibson coming up with Braveheart out of the true history of William Wallace, but making a movie that nobody was making in the early 1990s versus the 17th film in the Marvel Extended Universe.
Right. And again, I think this goes back to this idea of decadence being like you're playing not to lose. It's like,
Yep.
The movie studios know that a Marvel movie will do really well. So that's what they're going to put out. And they're not going to take a risk on, an eternal sunshine in the spotless mind.
Right. And when they do take risks, people get, punished or find that they don't have the capacities that you need. So this is my theory of Star Wars, right? That the original Star Wars movies are great, interesting, creative pastiches of old Hollywood, adventure movies and Akira Kurosawa and so on. And then Lucas wanted in the prequels to do something sort of deeper and more sweeping and more tragic and really interesting, right? So he had high ambitions. He just didn't have the capabilities and the capacities to actually do that. And so the results were kind of laughable. And so then thereafter, once the movies are turned over to Disney, you get the retreat to safety, the playing not to lose, where it's like, well, we tried doing doing movies about galactic politics with like Senate speeches and so on, and nobody wants to do that again. So we're just going to literally make the original trilogy over again with the same beats and, the genders of some characters switched. And that's how you get the J.J. Abrams Star Wars movies.
All right, so we've talked about stagnation with the economy, with culture, but another area where you highlight where decadence can take root and stagnate is in our institutions. So I'm talking about political institutions, you can even see corporate institutions. What are some examples of sort of stagnation there?
Well, so the easy one is just politics and government, right? And this is the part of decadence that I think everybody accepts as a reality. I get very little argument about this, that, basically over the last 40 or 50 years, you've had the combination of a 200-year-old constitutional structure, a 100-year-old welfare state, and partisan polarization make our political institutions less trustworthy, less trusted, and over time, completely dysfunctional. So, we've reached a point where, a president can expect to maybe pass one piece of legislation, even if his party controls the House and Senate when he takes office. You have these figures coming in different ways who seem like they could be revolutionary. Obama comes in and everyone's saying he's going to be the liberal FDR, and Donald Trump comes in and everyone says, oh, it's, this transformational populism. And then one thing happens and then nothing else happens for the rest of the presidency. And policy gets made increasingly by the bureaucracy and the courts, and Congress just sort of abdicates everything, except when there's a pandemic and you actually have to do something, right? So policy making still happens under emergency conditions. You have budgets get passed when you're going to hit the fiscal cliff. Bailouts happen when the economy is tanking, and we'll spend $2 trillion when the whole economy is shutting down. But otherwise, the system can't actually be reformed. And all of those emergency things that happen, you'll notice, just add more to deficit spending. Rightly so in certain cases. We should be doing more deficit spending in a pandemic, but it doesn't reflect any kind of structural reform. So that's politics. I think in other areas, what you have is, it's not that level of dysfunction, but you have a lot of, consolidation and monopoly power. I think that's again, a feature of sort of the playing not to lose dynamic that you were describing. So, even in Silicon Valley, right, the most dynamic sector of the economy has still ended up dominated by 4 or 5 companies after this brief Wild West period of real entrepreneurialism. And entrepreneurs then sort of compete to get bought up by these bigger companies. Or even like in higher education, where everyone said, the internet's going to come along and it's going to, hugely disrupt higher ed, and all these schools are going to have to be totally reinvented. And, maybe the pandemic will accelerate some of that. But, if you go and look at the U.S. News and World Report rankings of colleges, there's no list that's more stable, unchanging. Places move up and down. University of Chicago has climbed a little bit. But you would not look at American higher ed and say, oh, this is a sector where, you could start a new college and, become really successful and attract a lot of students. It's more like, no, you have these old behemoths competing for a shrinking population of students, relying on foreign student money to keep them solvent. And, the University of Phoenix isn't going to topple that system.
Well, yeah, that point you made about entrepreneurship, I think, there's this idea we have in our narrative that we have about ourselves in our current age, that we're an age of entrepreneurs. You look at all these tech startups. But you point out, and other economists have shown, is that we're actually less entrepreneurial than we were 40 or 50 years ago. Like fewer smaller businesses are opening up.
Yes, fewer old companies are going out of business. Fewer new companies are opening up. It's harder to keep a new company in business than it used to be. And also people are literally just not moving as much as they used to, which again is sort of surprising and counterintuitive. People say, the reason society is so adrift and atomized now is that everybody's moving around more and more and nobody stays in one place. But weirdly, Americans are more likely to stay in one place than they were 20 or 30 years ago. They're less likely to move in search of work. They're more likely to end up in the area where they grew up or the area where they moved after college. And that's a big shift and a sign of sort of, again, sclerosis, people getting locked in place. And it interacts with government policy too, right? So you have a large bureaucracies that are based in states that mean if you're whether you're getting welfare somewhere or if you have to pay child support, or, you have visitation rights, there are all kinds of structural forces that tend to keep people within state lines in a way that might not have been the case 50 years ago.
But is that necessarily a bad thing? Like people settling down or in establishing roots in a community? Or are people not moving and they're not doing that?
I think that the problem is they're not doing either, right? So you have a lot of these sort of, decayed communities that people that, don't provide enough work, but people aren't leaving them to find new work. And that's, I think, a story of, in a lot of sort of Midwestern, former Rust Belt America, you have a lot of towns and situations like that. A lot of the zones where the opioid epidemic is worst are like that. People, instead of moving, are getting hooked on drugs. So yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing to stay in or come back to your hometown. And there are ways in which we should probably want more people, sort of a certain kind of talented American would probably be better for the country if they did move back instead of just clustering in a few elite megacities. But for a lot of the people who are staying, they're not staying to put down roots. They're just staying and sort of drifting.
Yeah, I can see, if you moved a lot, there would be an incentive for you to get involved in your community because you're trying to get something. At least I saw that with my parents. They moved to a new place, and my mom was involved in the neighborhood women's group and planning parties and things like that. And that's not really happening anymore in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And it finally took like the moms who did this stuff 30 years ago to get it going again in my mom's neighborhood. So they're planning parties again. Well, not anymore because we got the pandemic going on. But it seems like this is like a forgotten skill of how to of community building. People just, again, I think it's a sign of decadence. Like this, I don't want to do this anymore. It's too much work. I don't know how to organize myself or other people.
Yeah, and it also reflects changes in family and the economy too, right? So like the other thing about our economy is it's not just that we, in order to have these growth rates or running higher deficits, we also have more people working than ever before, which is a good thing insofar as, it means that, women can be professionally fulfilled in a way that they couldn't be in 1945 or 1955. But it also means that families that would like to have one earner and have the other spouse at home can't, feel like they can't afford it. And that in turn means that the communities themselves have fewer people in them day to day. Not right now, but when the pandemic ends, if you have an economy built around two earner households, there isn't time and space for community building. There are, the neighborhoods of 60 years ago where kids played in the streets that worked because parents were home. And so you had a sense that your kids were being supervised by somebody, even if you weren't supervising themselves. And all of that goes away in a two-earner economy.
Well, speaking of family life, you also make this point that in a decadent society, fewer kids are born. What's going on there? What's causing the decrease in fertility? Is it economics? Or is it cultural shifts? Is it like a combination of all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be all of it together. It's a little bit mysterious. This is sort of one of the basic, almost universal facts about rich societies the world over, is that they all have too few kids to reproduce and sustain themselves. And the US was an outlier to this trend for a long time. And 20 years ago, there was sort of this assumption that, just like we were more religious than the rest of the developed world, we also had bigger families and more kids. But more recently, and especially since the Great Recession, that's changed, and our fertility rates are below replacement too, just like Europe and East Asia. And you have places where they're way below replacement. Like our fertility rate is like 1.7 now, with 2 being replacement level. Places like South Korea are down to 1. So they're literally having half as many kids as they would need to sort of maintain their current population. And some of this reflects obvious facts like, declining infant mortality means you don't have to have 7 kids to have 4 grow up to adulthood. We're not an agrarian economy anymore, so you don't need 5 strong sons to work in your fields. And women have more opportunities than they did 50 years ago, so they're less likely to become mothers. But it's really unclear why it's settled this low. Especially because people still say that they want more kids than we're actually having. Men and women both say the average desired fertility, desired family size is like 2.5 kids, and we're ending up with 1.6 or 1.7 kids instead. So it has to have something to do with these economic trends where people feel like they have to work harder to stay ahead, and the costs of these basic goods for families have gone up: education, healthcare, housing, and so on. But, it also has something to do with culture generally. It has something to do with the thing we were talking about at the beginning, that, rich societies or comfortable societies are less likely to take risks and, sort of try new things. And in this context, having a kid or having a large family is in certain ways one of the more challenging and riskier things that you can do. And so people do less of it. And then something's happened with the internet too, right? Where so far, internet dating, internet sex, pornography, all of these things seem to sort of push the sexes away from each other a little bit more. So it's not just the number of kids are going down, the number of people getting married is going down, number of people in relationships goes down, and the amount of sex goes down. Americans are having less sex than they did when I was in college, which, is hard to believe, let me tell you. But there it is.
No, yeah, we had that journalist from The Atlantic who did that article about the sex recession.
Oh, yeah.
And
That was a terrific piece.
Yeah, and all those factors. I mean, it's just sort of a whole bunch of factors going in on at once to cause less sex and relationship forming going. I'm sure. Well, I don't know. The pandemic could go either way.
I think the pandemic pushes people deeper into decadence. I think in this case, unless you get, I think you could see a bounce back where once people sort of post quarantine, once they're allowed out of the house and the economy starts recovering, that you could have, more dating, marriages, and babies then. But over the next year or so, nobody's going to be dating, right? Or they're going to be dating virtually. And you've already seen, Pornhub is doing very well, right? Like, this is a better moment probably for Pornhub than for baby making. Even if people are stuck in the house with, their spouse or significant other, they're in a context of, economic anxiety. If they already have kids, they're dealing with those kids. I don't know. I mean, we're having a baby in a couple weeks ourselves. So
wow.
sort of these thoughts are in my mind, but we didn't conceive the child in the lockdown, and I doubt that we would have.
So, I mean, what's the future of decadence? Are we just kind of going to just kind of hang out here for a while in this sort of blasé, boring, stagnant thing? Or, I mean, do we have to pray for an apocalypse? Like, do they all have to become accelerationists and want the world to end? Or can we work our way out of it?
So I don't think you don't want to pray for an apocalypse, right? Because
there's some people on the internet that do that, though.
No, I know. Listen, I totally understand that impulse. The desire for excitement, the desire for drama, but the reality is that most apocalypses, probably all apocalypses, are worse than decadence, and that decadence is bad, but as long as you're in it, there's a chance that you can get out of it without having to endure the collapse of civilization. And that should be option A, before you go all the way to Tyler Durden and blowing up the credit card companies and, people pounding MASH in the ruins of New York City. You might want to try you might want to try a renaissance without the Dark Age, I guess, first. But that's challenging, and it's hard to get one. And I think what you sort of can hope for, again, we're sort of living through a moment like this right now, is that instead of a big apocalypse coming along and leveling society, that a sort of moment of crisis that exposes some of the realities of decadence that are hidden when things are going well, that exposes sort of the problems in your public health bureaucracy, or, the problems in your government, or, the ways in which your society is sort of overextended and doesn't know how to make things anymore, and so on. Like that, something like that can be a spur to change and transformation in a way that doesn't require, 100 million dead people. So that would be the sort of the optimistic take on the era we're living through now, is that once we come out of this agony, there will be sort of an opportunity to shift things in our politics, shift things in our economy, to have a little more growth and dynamism, to sort of, maybe people go so deep into the virtual cocoon during the lockdown that they come out and they're ready to do more things in the real world. But it's also totally possible, right, that, you go through a crisis like this and people come out of it and they tell each other, now everything's going to be different. But in fact, you sort of slip back into the way things were before very quickly, except your system, your government is a little more discredited. Your local communities are a little less functional, and you're just actually a little deeper in decadence than you were before. And, that in the Roman Empire, right? Like Rome had a series of epidemics, pandemics over its hundreds of years of decline that played a big role in the decline. And after each one, there was presumably opportunities for reinvigoration that, you got a Diocletian and a Constantine. Sometimes they took them. But for the most part, they just sort of pushed the empire further along its decadent trajectory.
I mean, it sounds like if any change is going to happen, like a renaissance, it'll have to be bottom up. Like, you can't look to the institutions that are decrepit to save you from decadence.
Well, I think for most people listening to this podcast, that's absolutely right. Yeah, the war against decadence starts in your home or business or community, right? You sort of strike a blow against decadence when you start a company or start a family, or, during the pandemic, plant a garden in your backyard, or figure out how to, repair things yourselves. Like, that sort of attitude, I think, is the appropriate one for the average person, maybe especially the average man, to take. That being said, if you're in politics, right? I mean, I write a column about politics as my day job. So I spend a certain amount of time thinking about, what should senators be thinking about? What should people who work for a president be thinking about? There are ways in which, individual actors can try and redirect a system, right? You do have these moments in history where, really talented political figures come along and effectively rebuild or refound a system. I don't think you can give up on the idea that some kind of political refounding is possible, and that could then have, some kind of virtuous interaction with the efforts that people are making from the bottom up. So if you get the right statesman, you could get policies that make the life of the entrepreneur or the father easier than it is under our current situation.
I like that idea of individuals pushing back against decadence. Reminded me of that Flannery O'Connor quote, push back against the age as hard as it pushes against you.
But in this case, you have to push harder, right? Because the thing about decadence is it's this sort of soft pillow, right? Like that's sort of the challenge in a way, is that it's not, it's not like, I think about this in the context of religion, right? Because I'm a practicing Catholic of some kind. And, you have a lot of my sort of fellow believers who will say, well, as America becomes less Christian, we're going to get to a point where society is so anti-Christian that you'll have a landscape of persecution or something. And I don't think that's actually the challenge. I think the challenge for religious people, which I think applies beyond religion, is that society is not going to persecute you. They're just going to sort of, ignore you and encourage you to, not get up and go to church on Sunday morning because it's much easier to sit around and see what's on Netflix. And that applies, I think that applies across the board. I think, there's nobody, maybe someone in your, zoning committee or someone in City Hall is going to keep you from building an addition to your house. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's like bureaucratic red tape here and there, but nobody's preventing you from starting a family. Nobody's forcing you not to get married. It's just, there's a lot of other entertaining stuff you could be doing, and it's easy to just, marijuana's legal now, right? You can just sort of drift. It's soft, so you have to push harder.
Push harder. I like that. Well, Ross, this has been a great conversation. There's some place people can go to learn more about the book and your work.
Yes, I mean, obviously copies are available at Amazon.com, but I should also say, since we're in this pandemic moment, that if you have a local bookstore that is, selling books, delivering books, having you pick up books to try and, keep making some money in this context, I would obviously urge you to buy the book there and support your local businesses. And then, I write a column twice a week for the New York Times, so you can find me there, and on Twitter at DouthatNYT.
All right, well, Ross Douthat, thanks so much time. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
My guest today was Ross Douthat. He is the author of the book, The Decadent Society. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. Also check out our show notes at aom.is/decadence, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.